Adrenal insufficiency forces patients to manually operate their own endocrine system, turning a simple cup of coffee or a momentary scare into a potentially fatal event. Wellness culture treats cortisol like a villain, a stress hormone we need to eliminate. But for the roughly 1 in 20,000 people living without it, cortisol is the only shock absorber the human body has. When you stop producing it automatically, the medical system hands you a static pill and expects you to replicate a dynamic, minute-by-minute biological rhythm. The physiological math is impossible to get perfectly right, leaving patients trapped in a constant state of calculation just to survive Tuesday.
The magnitude of that constant calculation goes completely unrecognized by almost everyone outside of the patient community. The articles on the My Adrenal Life platform capture this reality better than most medical literature because they focus on the lived experience of the missing physiological buffer. In a functioning human body, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, is constantly reading the environment and adjusting the internal thermostat without any conscious input. You stand up too fast, your body releases a microdose of cortisol to constrict your blood vessels so you don't pass out. You get into a heated argument, your body floods the system with cortisol to mobilize glucose so your brain has the immediate energy to process the threat. It happens automatically. But when you have Addison's disease or secondary adrenal insufficiency, that automatic response is entirely gone. The thermostat is broken. The furnace is disconnected. And the implications of that missing buffer touch every single biological process in the body.
That requires anticipating every physical demand before it actually happens. You are essentially asking a patient to act as their own hypothalamus.
It requires predicting the unpredictable, which is an impossible task. The platform emphasizes how cortisol is framed incorrectly in our culture. We hear the word and immediately think of chronic stress, belly fat, burnout. We think of it as a consequence of modern living that needs to be minimized or eradicated with expensive supplements. But fundamentally, cortisol is the life hormone. It governs vascular tone. It dictates how the immune system responds to pathogens. It manages the inflammatory response. When someone with autoimmune adrenalitis loses 90% of their adrenal cortex, which is typically the threshold for clinical presentation according to the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Diseases, they lose the ability to manage basic homeostasis. The medication they take, usually an oral dose of hydrocortisone, replaces the baseline amount of hormone needed to stay alive. It does not replace the dynamic, reactive buffering system. It provides a floor, but it offers no ceiling when the demands of the day unexpectedly increase.
A static dose for a highly variable existence.
Which is why stability is a dangerous illusion for these patients. A person might take their morning dose and feel perfectly regulated at 8 o'clock in the morning. But by noon, if they had a stressful meeting, or if it is unseasonably hot outside, or if they are fighting off an asymptomatic virus that their immune system is quietly battling, they burn through that static dose significantly faster than anticipated. Suddenly, they are operating in a metabolic deficit. Their blood pressure begins to drop. Their blood sugar crashes because cortisol is absolutely necessary for gluconeogenesis in the liver. They start experiencing profound muscle weakness, nausea, and cognitive fog. The medical term is approaching adrenal crisis, but the patient experience is simply feeling the life drain out of their body in real time, often while sitting at a desk or standing in a grocery line, looking completely normal to everyone around them.
The contrast between the internal biological emergency and the external appearance of normalcy must create a massive psychological burden. You are fighting for your life while buying milk.
The invisibility is perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the disease. According to research published by the American Academy of Family Physicians, the estimated prevalence is 1 in 20,000 persons in the United States and Western Europe. It is rare enough that many emergency room doctors will never treat a patient in active adrenal crisis during their entire medical career. So when a patient arrives at the hospital, hypotensive, vomiting, perhaps slipping into a confused state due to low blood sodium, the clinical presentation often mimics severe food poisoning or a psychiatric event. The patient or their advocate has to essentially educate the medical staff while their organs are beginning to shut down. The My Adrenal Life community frequently highlights the necessity of wearing medical alert bracelets and carrying injectable emergency glucocorticoids, precisely because relying on a stranger to understand the nuances of a broken HPA axis is a gamble. You are walking a tightrope every day, and the safety net is whatever knowledge you carry with you.
We treat everyday consumption as biologically neutral. A cup of coffee, a glass of wine, even secondhand smoke. These are background elements of adult life. But the myadrenal status, or CHIRA, detailing chemical stressors, frames these substances as immediate threats when the physiological buffer is missing.
That specific article is vital because it addresses the mundane realities of socializing and existing in the modern world. Let us look at nicotine and vaping, for instance. The sympathetic nervous system reacts to nicotine with rapid stimulation. Adrenaline and norepinephrine surge through the bloodstream. In a body with a functioning adrenal cortex, cortisol is immediately released to counterbalance that surge, stabilizing the heart rate and blood pressure. It acts as a dampener. In a body with adrenal insufficiency, the adrenaline spikes, but the cortisol dampener never arrives. The patient experiences severe autonomic instability. Their heart races, they might become incredibly dizzy. Their body is flooded with the physical sensation of panic or impending doom, not because they are anxious, but because their neurochemistry has been violently shifted without a net to catch it.
The nervous system is accelerating while the brakes have been effectively cut.
The exact same mechanical problem applies to caffeine. People drink coffee to feel energized, but that energy is partially derived from caffeine, prompting the adrenal glands to release a small amount of cortisol and adrenaline. If your adrenal glands are atrophied due to autoimmune destruction, or if your pituitary gland isn't sending the adrenocorticotropic hormone, the ACTH signal, to tell them to work, the caffeine still demands an energy release from the body. But the body has no stored reserve to draw from. It forces the system to run on empty, often leading to a paradoxical crash. The patient drinks an espresso and an hour later feels entirely depleted, physically aching, sometimes experiencing joint pain or a low-grade fever, because the caffeine induced a stress state that the body could not physiologically manage. The substance demanded a biological response that the system was incapable of providing.
Alcohol presents a different mechanical problem, focusing on the liver rather than direct stimulation of the nervous system.
Alcohol is a central nervous system depressant, but its primary danger for this specific population lies in its interference with gluconeogenesis. The liver is busy processing the alcohol, clearing the toxin, which takes biological priority over its normal job of releasing glucose into the bloodstream to maintain stable blood sugar levels. Cortisol is the critical hormone that signals the liver to release that glucose when levels dip. Without sufficient cortisol, and with the liver occupied by the alcohol, the risk of hypoglycemia skyrockets. A person with adrenal insufficiency can have a single beer at a barbecue and find themselves dangerously hypoglycemic 2 hours later. The symptoms of low blood sugar, slurred speech, profound confusion, stumbling, are visually identical to the symptoms of heavy intoxication.
That creates a scenario where a life-threatening medical emergency is easily mistaken for drunkenness by bystanders or even paramedics,
Which delays life-saving treatment and increases the risk of mortality. If someone is found unresponsive after a party, the immediate assumption is alcohol poisoning. If they have Addison's disease, they might be in an acute adrenal crisis, triggered by severe hypoglycemia. The treatment for the latter requires the immediate intravenous administration of a synthetic corticosteroid, usually hydrocortisone, along with dextrose to stabilize the blood sugar. If the paramedics merely try to let them sleep off the perceived intoxication, they could die. The margin for error is incredibly thin. The article stresses that these patients do not have to live in a sterile bubble, but they must calculate the metabolic cost of every single substance they ingest. They have to decide if a glass of wine is worth the potential necessity of taking an extra stress dose of their steroid medication to handle the physiological fallout later that evening.
I struggle with the idea that the medication itself cannot be optimized to handle these daily fluctuations. We have continuous glucose monitors and closed-loop insulin pumps for type 1 diabetes that mimic the pancreas with remarkable precision. Why does endocrinology accept such a crude replacement strategy for the adrenal glands? It seems like an artificial limitation rather than a biological impossibility.
The comparison to insulin is incredibly common, but it misses a fundamental distinction in how these hormones operate and how we measure them. Blood glucose levels are easily measurable in real time. A diabetic patient can prick their finger or check their continuous monitor and know exactly what their body requires in that exact moment. There is no at-home, real-time monitor for serum cortisol. The technology simply does not exist yet. Cortisol levels fluctuate dramatically throughout the day in a diurnal rhythm, peaking in the early morning to wake you up and gradually tapering off until hitting a nadir around midnight. But it also spikes instantly in response to thousands of different stimuli: a cold breeze, a startling noise, a sudden drop in barometric pressure, a microinflammation in the gut. You cannot program a pump to anticipate a sudden emotional shock.
Wait, but surely a mechanical pump mechanism could deliver a baseline diurnal curve much better than swallowing a pill 3 times a day. We can program the baseline, even if we can't program the unpredictable spikes.
You are correct that a pump is vastly superior for delivering the baseline circadian rhythm. Researchers in the UK and Scandinavia are experimenting with subcutaneous hydrocortisone pumps, utilizing modified insulin pumps, and the results show significantly improved quality of life for a subset of patients. They wake up with cortisol already in their system, mimicking a healthy body. But it is not a universally accessible or standardized treatment. Insurance companies often refuse to cover it because it is considered off-label use. The vast majority of patients are relying on oral pills. The half-life of oral hydrocortisone is incredibly short, roughly 90 minutes to a few hours depending on individual liver metabolism. So patients are forced to chop tiny pills into fragments, dosing 3, 4, or 5 times a day, attempting to manually sketch a smooth biological curve using jagged, fragmented spikes of oral medication. It is an archaic way to treat a complex endocrine failure.
That still sounds like a failure of medical engineering and investment. We mapped the human genome, yet we ask patients to treat a life-threatening endocrine disorder by biting a pill in half at 2 in the afternoon.
It is a profound failure of prioritization in medical research. Addison's disease is classified as a rare disease. According to Medscape data from 2024, the prevalence is there NAICOSH, 40 to 60 cases per 1 million population in many developed nations. The financial incentive for pharmaceutical companies to develop a sophisticated, FDA-approved closed-loop cortisol pump is minuscule compared to the massive diabetes market. So patients are left in this analog era of treatment, and the crude nature of the treatment introduces its own devastating set of risks. The Adrenal Life platform dedicates an entire podcast episode to the cardiovascular effects of long-term steroid replacement, because you are never getting the dose exactly right. You are either slightly under-replaced, living in a state of chronic fatigue and low-grade inflammation, or you are slightly over-replaced, exposing your organs to excess synthetic glucocorticoids.
The medication required to prevent an acute crisis today simultaneously drives long-term chronic damage tomorrow.
That is the trap every patient navigates. The Stat Pearls publication from the NIH explicitly states that overtreatment with glucocorticoids may result in obesity, diabetes, and severe osteoporosis, while overtreatment with mineralocorticoids, which patients with primary adrenal insufficiency also require to replace the missing hormone aldosterone, can cause hypertension. Over decades, this imperfect replacement strategy takes a massive toll on the vascular system. Cortisol sensitizes the blood vessels to adrenaline. When a patient takes a dose of hydrocortisone, their blood vessels constrict more easily. When the dose wears off a few hours later, that sensitization fades, and the blood pressure can drop. The vascular system is subjected to a constant, subtle expansion and contraction, a mechanical stress that a healthy, dynamically regulated body simply does not experience.
The patient is caught between the immediate threat of hypovolemic shock and the slow, insidious threat of cardiovascular disease.
Which is why a long-term study by Chansa Christos indicated that patients who have both diabetes and Addison's disease have a significantly higher mortality rate, 28% over a roughly 6-year follow-up, compared to 10% for those with diabetes alone. The cardiovascular risk is magnified exponentially. The frustration within the patient community is palpable. When they present to a cardiologist with wildly fluctuating blood pressure or a creeping cholesterol level, the typical clinical response is to prescribe a statin or a standard blood pressure medication. Very rarely does the specialist consider the mechanics of the hydrocortisone dosing schedule as the primary driver of the cardiovascular changes. The disease is heavily siloed in modern medicine. The endocrinologist handles the cortisol replacement, the cardiologist handles the heart function, but the patient's body operates as a single, inextricably linked, struggling system.
That systemic struggle becomes undeniable during periods of compound stress. The My Adrenal Life article on The Stack outlines what happens when emotional trauma, physical injury, and chronic illness overlap. The medical framework usually separates acute grief from a surgical recovery.
They separate them because, in a healthy person, the body can somewhat compartmentalize the emotional experience, while the biological mechanisms silently handle the physical recovery in the background. But the HPA axis does not read context. The hypothalamus does not categorize the sudden loss of a parent as a purely emotional event and a gallbladder removal as a purely physical event. It registers both simply as high-level systemic stressors demanding massive amounts of cortisol. When a patient with adrenal insufficiency experiences the stack, say they lose a loved one, and the immense stress of that grief triggers a latent autoimmune flare, leading to a hospitalization, the math of their survival completely breaks down. The physiological demand vastly exceeds the static supply.
The standard protocol is to double the dose of hydrocortisone during physical illness, but there is no medical consensus on how to dose for grief.
None whatsoever. The endocrinology guidelines for stress dosing are almost entirely focused on physical trauma. If you have a fever over 100 degrees, you double the dose. If you have severe vomiting, you inject the emergency vial and go straight to the hospital. But the inflammatory burden of profound emotional trauma is immense. We know from neurobiological research that acute grief causes a measurable, significant increase in systemic inflammation. In a healthy body, the adrenals pump out extra cortisol to soothe that inflammation and protect the organs. The grieving person might feel exhausted and heavy, but their body handles the internal chemical fire. For the patient with Addison's disease, the fire burns completely unchecked. They are operating on their baseline daily dose of medication while their internal system is experiencing a Category 5 metabolic storm.
I question the utility of treating emotional grief as a literal metabolic equivalent to a physical injury. If we instruct patients to flood their system with extra steroids every time they receive permits, aren't we accelerating the exact cardiovascular damage we just discussed? It feels like pathologizing a normal human experience.
We are not talking about a bad day at work or ordinary sadness. We are talking about profound, nervous system altering trauma or acute grief. And failing to treat it as a metabolic event is precisely what leads these patients into life-threatening crises. The failure to bounce back after a tragedy is often viewed by society as a moral failing or clinical depression. But for this specific population, it is literal physiological shutdown. When the body's demand for cortisol outpaces the supply for an extended period, the nervous system enters a deep state of preservation. It slows everything down to conserve energy. The patient experiences deep lethargy, cognitive withdrawal, sensory overload. They become entirely depleted, unable to process sound or light, not because they are depressed, but because their brain does not have the glucose to function.
But increasing the steroid dose based on an emotional metric is entirely subjective. A doctor cannot measure the severity of grief to prescribe the correct milligram adjustment,
Which forces the patient to become their own clinician, interpreting their physical symptoms as direct proxies for their metabolic state. If they are grieving and they suddenly cannot stand up without their vision going black, or they develop a continuous dull ache in their lower back, which is a classic hallmark symptom of low cortisol, they have to increase their dose. They are not pathologizing the grief. They are responding to the physiological damage the grief is inflicting on a body without shock absorbers. The article on the stack emphasizes the crucial difference between recovery and recalibration. After a massive compound stressor, the patient might not return to their previous baseline. Their body has spent weeks or months running a massive deficit, and the cellular exhaustion is profound.
The expectation of a linear recovery is a luxury of a functioning endocrine system.
It is a cultural myth that harms chronically ill people every single day. We expect a surgical recovery to take exactly 6 weeks. We expect the acute phase of grief to soften after a few months. When a patient with secondary adrenal insufficiency takes a full year to recover from a minor surgery because the surgical stress depleted their system so completely, society loses patience with them. Doctors run standard metabolic panels. The tests come back within normal limits, and the patient is told their lingering fatigue is psychosomatic. The lab tests lie by omission. A standard blood test measures the circulating cortisol right at that exact moment. It does not measure the capacity of the system to handle the load it is carrying, nor does it measure the cellular fatigue accumulated over months of under-replacement.
That disconnect between how the patient feels and what the data shows extends perfectly into how we approach nutrition. The article, Supporting the Body Without Rigid Rules, directly attacks the negatives. The wellness industry's obsession with restrictive diets.
Nutrition is a deeply fraught topic for people with adrenal insufficiency. When traditional medicine offers only a crude steroid replacement, patients desperately search for other levers they can pull to feel better. Wellness culture swoops in and tells them that if they eliminate gluten, dairy, sugar, and processed foods, they can heal their fatigue. It frames dietary purity as the ultimate solution to their metabolic chaos. But the article explicitly pushes back against this fear-mongering. Food does not replace cortisol. A perfectly clean diet will not restart a destroyed adrenal cortex. And more importantly, strict dietary rules often act as an additional, severe stressor on a system that is already struggling to maintain basic stability.
The discipline required to maintain a restrictive diet becomes an active metabolic drain.
Yes, and the physical mechanics of eating are altered by the disease itself. Let us look at how blood sugar is managed. Fasting, which is incredibly popular right now for longevity and metabolic health, is highly dangerous for someone who cannot produce cortisol. If a healthy person fasts for 16 hours, their cortisol rises to trigger gluconeogenesis, keeping their blood sugar perfectly stable. If an adrenal insufficiency patient attempts intermittent fasting, their blood sugar simply plummets. They wake up nauseous, shaking, and completely drained. The wellness influencer tells them they are just pushing through a normal detox phase, but in biological reality, they are pushing their body toward a severe hypoglycemic crisis.
I understand the danger of fasting, but dismissing dietary intervention entirely seems defeatist. We know that autoimmune diseases respond to inflammatory triggers. If autoimmune adrenalitis is the cause of Addison's disease for up to 94% of patients in the industrialized world, shouldn't reducing systemic inflammation through diet be a primary clinical objective?
It is not about dismissing nutrition. It is about reframing the goal. The goal cannot be curing the disease or achieving some optimal state of biological purity. The goal has to be stability. Steady is safe. The article provides a nuanced look at the difference between primary and secondary adrenal insufficiency, regarding salt, for example. In primary Addison's disease, the outer layer of the adrenal cortex is destroyed, meaning the patient loses both cortisol and aldosterone. Aldosterone regulates sodium in the kidneys. Without it, the body flushes sodium into the urine, leading to severe dehydration, low blood pressure, and a profound physiological salt craving.
They literally need to consume massive amounts of sodium just to keep their blood volume up.
Exactly. They must salt everything. But in secondary or tertiary adrenal insufficiency, the defect is in the pituitary or the hypothalamus. The ACTH signal is missing, which halts cortisol production, but the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system usually remains intact. So secondary patients often retain their ability to regulate sodium normally. If you apply a one-size-fits-all adrenal diet to everyone, you are giving incredibly dangerous advice. The person with Addison's needs to liberally salt everything they eat to prevent shock. The person with secondary disease does not have that same requirement and could drive their blood pressure up unnecessarily. The rigidity of diet culture ignores these critical, life or death physiological distinctions.
The advice has to shift from restriction to pure nourishment.
Nourishment as a medical necessity, not a moral test. The My Adrenal Life article gives people absolute permission to use convenience foods if cooking requires too much energy. If standing at the stove for 30 minutes is going to burn through the last of your cortisol for the day, leaving you unable to digest the meal you just cooked, then eating a processed meal from the microwave is objectively the healthier choice. We have internalized the idea that health requires suffering, that if a meal isn't painstakingly prepared from organic ingredients, it doesn't count. But for someone operating a broken endocrine system, the suffering is already built into their daily existence. The food should be the easiest part of their day. Lowering the barrier to entry for self-care is a vital survival tactic.
That baseline of survival is precarious. We have circled the concept of the adrenal crisis, but the statistics anchor the severity of this condition. Despite medical advancements, the mortality rate for patients with Addison's disease remains significantly higher than the general population.
It is a sobering reality. According to studies highlighted by Medscape, cardiovascular deaths account for the highest mortality rate long-term, but the death rate from infectious diseases is disproportionately high in patients with Addison's. An exposure to a simple gastric infection, a stomach bug, is identified as the single most important risk factor for precipitating an acute adrenal crisis. If a patient catches a norovirus and begins vomiting, they immediately lose the ability to absorb their oral hydrocortisone medication. Within hours, their circulating cortisol levels drop to zero. The severe lack of cortisol causes life-threatening low blood pressure, low blood sodium, dangerously high blood potassium, and eventual vascular collapse.
The transition from a manageable afternoon to a critical emergency happens in a window of hours.
Sometimes less. And the reliance on emergency medical services in those moments can be terrifying. Patients carry a specialized injection kit containing a vial of Solu-Cortef, which is a powdered hydrocortisone, and a syringe. They must mix the powder and the liquid, draw it up, and inject it deeply into a muscle while they are actively deteriorating and losing cognitive function. If they are alone and slip into confusion before they can administer the shot, the outcome can be fatal. This is why the educational burden is so heavy. The My Adrenal Life platform exists precisely because patients cannot rely on the general public or even general medical practitioners to possess this hyper-specific knowledge. The patient must act as the primary expert on their own biology at all times, educating paramedics while they are slipping into shock.
They are carrying the cognitive load of a physician on top of the physical load of the illness.
It is a relentless, exhausting vigilance. You are constantly scanning your body for deficits. Is that headache just a headache, or is it the start of a cortisol drop? Am I irritable because I slept poorly, or is my brain misfiring because my blood sugar is unstable and I need to stress dose? You never get to simply inhabit your body. You have to manage it like a pilot flying a plane with a failing engine. You are always watching the gauges, making minute adjustments, trying to predict the weather patterns ahead so you don't stall out and crash.
The trajectory of this disease forces a complete reimagining of what it means to be healthy. The medical system defines health as the absence of disease, but for synths, someone with adrenal insufficiency, health is the successful, active management of a permanent deficit. It requires shifting the goal away from fixing the underlying broken machinery and toward mastering the manual operation of the system.
Mastering the manual operation means abandoning the expectation of a perfect simulation. The synthetic hormones will never perfectly replicate the elegant, dynamic dance of a healthy HPA axis. There will be days when the math fails, when the stress of a virus or the weight of grief causes the system to crash, despite the patient doing everything flawlessly. Accepting that reality is not giving up. It is recognizing the boundaries of the tools we currently possess. The conversation we've traced today, from the hidden dangers of ordinary caffeine to the profound physiological impact of cumulative trauma, reveals that living with adrenal insufficiency is an ongoing, daily negotiation with reality. It demands a level of grace and flexibility that the rigid protocols of wellness culture and standard medicine rarely afford.
The true vulnerability isn't just the lack of a hormone, it is existing in a world built for automatic biology while you are running on manual. The insights from My Adrenal Life provide a vocabulary for that invisible labor, illuminating the profound effort required simply to remain steady.
Steady is the victory. Understanding the mechanics of the physiological buffer doesn't just help the patients, it gives the rest of us a profound appreciation for the silent, automatic miracles occurring inside our own bodies every single second of the day.
If this breakdown shifted how you look at chronic illness or the invisible labor of surviving, send this episode to someone who needs to hear it. The conversation doesn't end here, it just moves to the next listener.